The sun beat down relentlessly on the small town of Redstone Ridge, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The town square, usually filled with the noise of livestock and the clamor of the blacksmith's hammer, was eerily silent today. The square had become a stage for something that would change the lives of its inhabitants forever, although none of them knew it yet. Sheriff McKenna stood at the front of the auction block, a heavy gavel in his hand, his face set in a grim, disapproving expression. His eyes scanned the crowd of townsfolk gathered around, none of them speaking a word, each person bracing themselves for what they were about to witness. A man, shackled and marked by his captivity, stood in the center of the block. He was no stranger to the harsh realities of life on the fringes of society. Samuel Tallbear had been caught stealing horses from the Matt Ranch. But to the people of Redstone Ridge, he was far more than just a thief. He was a savage, a relic of a time they believed was long gone. His people had been pushed out, forced to live in the shadows, only remembered by the cruelty they had suffered. Samuel stood still, his chains clinking softly, as the sheriff called out, "Who'll bid for him? The savage who's made a mockery of our town." The word savage stung the air like a whip crack. The crowd shuffled uncomfortably, some looking away, others staring hard at the man who had been reduced to little more than an object for sale. Clara Whitford stood in the back of the crowd, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching. She was a woman whose name was already spoken with disdain in certain circles. A widow, barely 30, who had inherited her late husband's failing ranch. The land was dying, the cattle had been sold off, and with each passing day, she found herself on the brink of losing everything. But Clara was not the kind of woman to give up, not without a fight. She had learned that in the months following Jacob's sudden death. In those dark months, she had fought to keep her ranch alive, even when the world around her told her it was time to let go. $70, the sheriff called out again, shaking his head in disbelief at the small sum. That's all. For a man condemned for theft, a savage. But Clara didn't hear him. She had already made up her mind. She stepped forward, her boots clicking against the wooden planks of the platform as she moved. The crowd parted to let her through, whispers of surprise and suspicion trailing behind her. She had no family left in the town, and her husband's name was barely spoken now. No one cared about a woman who had come into this place with nothing but a broken heart and a barren ranch. "I'll buy him." Clara's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. The sheriff looked at her, his face unreadable for a moment before he sneered. "70? You'll need more than that to buy him. He's no man for the likes of you, Clara Whitford." But Clara's eyes didn't falter. She was staring at Samuel now, her gaze firm, unwavering. Samuel's dark eyes met hers for the first time, and something passed between them. A silent acknowledgement of their shared loneliness, their shared struggle. "I'll give you $100. The sheriff paused. The crowd went silent, and Clara felt the weight of every eye in the square on her. She was well aware of the risks. Everyone in town had already decided that Samuel wasn't worth saving. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this man. Something that needed to be seen, something that needed to be set free. McKenna's hand tightened around the gavel. "Sold," he said reluctantly, and with that single word, everything shifted. Clara stepped forward, unlocking the shackles from Samuel's wrists with steady hands. She didn't flinch as the metal clicked open, and she ignored the sheriff's disapproving glare. She didn't care. This was her decision, and she wasn't going to back down now. Samuel didn't move at first. His eyes were locked on the sheriff, as though expecting an order, a command, or perhaps even a warning. But Clara didn't offer any of those things. She simply stepped back and gestured for him to follow. "You're free now," she said, her voice softer than she intended. The words felt foreign coming from her mouth, but she meant them. Samuel stood there for a moment longer, as though unsure of what to do next. But slowly, his gaze shifted to Clara, and in that moment, she saw something in his eyes, something that made her heart tighten in her chest. He wasn't just a man who had been bought and sold. He was someone who had been broken by the world, someone who had been stripped of everything, but not by her, not yet. He finally stepped down from the block, his movements slow but deliberate. Clara led him away from the crowd, ignoring the whispers and sidelong glances. She didn't care about their judgment. She had made her choice. As they reached the edge of the square, Clara noticed the town had fallen into an uneasy silence. There was no applause, no cheers, just a quiet hum of disapproval that seemed to hang in the air. Clara didn't mind. She was used to being judged. She had been judged since the day Jacob died. They walked in silence toward her ranch, the wagon waiting in the distance. Clara didn't speak to Samuel. She didn't expect him to speak either. There was a tension between them, a shared weight they didn't need to address. Samuel was still unsure of her, still unsure of what she was offering, and Clara was unsure of what she was doing too. But she knew she couldn't leave him behind. The ranch was a long way from town, and as they traveled, the evening light began to fade. The shadows stretched long across the land, and Clara felt the weight of the journey pressing down on her. Her heart was heavy with uncertainty, but there was also something else, something that whispered to her deep inside. She had made the right decision. "Thank you," Samuel said finally, his voice rough and low. The words hung in the air, and Clara didn't know how to respond. She had expected him to speak sooner, but she hadn't expected this. "Thank you." "For what?" She glanced back at him, meeting his dark gaze once more. "You're welcome," she said quietly, and that was all. The ride continued in silence, but Clara's mind was racing. She knew she had just made the first step towards something big, something that could change everything. But what if she was wrong? What if Samuel wasn't the answer she had been searching for? She didn't know, but she had to try, for her sake, for his. As they neared the ranch, Clara looked at the land, once rich and vibrant, now dry and cracked. It was a ghost of what it had been, just like her life. But she couldn't give up. Not yet. They arrived at the ranch, and Clara stopped the wagon in front of the dilapidated house. The place was in ruins, but it was still home. For now, it was enough. "Tomorrow, we begin," Clara said, turning to Samuel. He didn't reply, but she could see the faintest nod from him. The journey had only just begun. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a twilight that softened the harsh edges of the ranch. The sky was a deep, inky blue, littered with stars that twinkled faintly above. The air was cooler now, carrying with it a sense of quiet that only the wilderness could provide. The only sounds were the creaking of the wagon's wheels as Clara led Samuel to the small, ramshackle cabin she called home. Clara stopped just outside the door and surveyed the land. The barn was in worse shape than she had imagined. Its roof sagged in places, and the fences were barely standing. The once thriving farm now felt like a distant memory. But it was all she had left, and if she were to rebuild, she would have to do it herself. "This is it," Clara said, her voice steady. She wasn't asking for sympathy or understanding. She simply wanted Samuel to see the reality of what they faced. Samuel's gaze moved slowly across the land, his eyes lingering on the barn, the dry earth, and the worn fence posts. He didn't speak at first, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his silence that made Clara uneasy, as if he was weighing something that she couldn't quite grasp. "I'll help you fix it," Samuel finally said, his voice low but firm. He looked at her, and for the first time, Clara saw a flicker of resolve in his eyes. It was brief, but it was there. Clara nodded, her heart racing. "Tomorrow, we start. There's work to be done." She didn't wait for a reply as she turned and entered the cabin. The inside was as worn as the outside, with a single table, 2 chairs, and a small hearth. The walls, once white, had yellowed over time, and dust lay thick on every surface. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It was all she had left. "You can sleep on the floor." Clara pointed to the small rug by the fireplace. It wasn't much of a bed, but it would have to do. Samuel didn't object. He simply moved to the corner of the room, taking off his worn boots and sitting down. The silence stretched between them again, thick and heavy. Clara couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. He had been through so much, too much, really, and she couldn't imagine the weight of his past pressing on him. As Clara moved to the kitchen to light the stove, her thoughts drifted back to the town square. The look on the townspeople's faces when she had bought Samuel. They had seen him as nothing more than an object, something to be discarded. She had felt their eyes on her, their judgment heavy in the air. It had been a test of her own strength, and she knew the real challenge had only just begun. The fire crackled softly as Clara heated water, and she couldn't help but glance back at Samuel. He hadn't spoken since their arrival, but she could feel his presence in the room. He was still an enigma to her, a man who had been broken and was now trying to pick up the pieces. She wasn't sure how to help him, but she would try. She had to. "You want something to eat?" Clara asked, breaking the silence. Samuel's eyes lifted to meet hers, and for a moment Clara thought he might refuse, but then slowly he nodded. Clara took down a small loaf of bread from the shelf and cut off a slice, passing it to him with a bowl of stew. "It's not much, but it's what I've got." Samuel took the food, his movements slow but deliberate. He didn't eat right away, as if savoring the moment of quiet. He looked down at the bowl in his hands, his fingers tracing the edges as if lost in thought. "Thank you," he said again, his voice softer this time, almost hesitant. Clara sat down across from him, watching him for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing what feels right." Samuel looked up at her, his eyes shadowed with something she couldn't quite place. "I don't know how to repay you," he said, his voice heavy with a burden that seemed far older than he was. "You don't have to." Clara leaned back, letting out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "Just help me fix this place. That's enough for now." But Samuel shook his head slowly. "I don't just need help. I need purpose." His voice faltered for a moment, then steadied again. "I've been lost for too long." Clara sat in silence for a moment, processing his words. She knew what it was like to feel lost. After Jacob's death, she had felt adrift, as though her whole life had been torn from her in one cruel moment. But here, in this cabin, in this moment, Clara was beginning to realize that there was more to this than she had originally thought. She wasn't just helping Samuel rebuild his life. He was helping her rebuild hers too. The tension in the room thickened as the fire crackled. Outside, the wind began to pick up, and Clara could hear the distant rumble of thunder, a reminder of the storms that would soon come. But inside the cabin, there was an odd sense of calm. They were both strangers to this land, both haunted by their pasts. But maybe, just maybe, they could find something here, together. After a long silence, Samuel spoke again. "What's your story? Why did you buy me?" His voice was quieter now, more personal, and Clara felt the weight of his question settle on her. Clara hesitated, her mind wandering back to the days after Jacob's death. She had never spoken much about it to anyone. The pain was still raw, still fresh, and every time she thought about it, the wound felt like it had never healed. But Samuel was different. There was no judgment in his eyes, no expectation, just quiet curiosity. "I lost my husband a year ago." Clara's voice trembled slightly, but she kept going. "Jacob was everything to me. I had a life with him, a dream, and then he was gone, just like that." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I've been fighting to keep this place from falling apart ever since, but I can't do it alone." Samuel said nothing, but his gaze softened. He wasn't sure what to say, but somehow Clara knew he understood. His past had been full of loss too. The storm outside grew louder, and the first few drops of rain began to splatter against the windows. Clara stood and walked over to the window, watching as the sky darkened further. It was a storm that felt as though it could wash everything away. Everything, except for her resolve. "Tomorrow, we'll start fixing the barn," Clara said, turning back to face him. "One step at a time." Samuel looked at her, his expression unreadable, but this time he didn't look away. "We'll fix it," he said, his voice steady. And in that moment, Clara felt something shift between them, something unspoken, something fragile but real. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, Clara and Samuel found a fleeting sense of peace. The morning after the storm was calm, the sky a soft shade of pale blue, as if the earth itself had exhaled in relief. The rain had washed away the dust of the land, leaving behind a freshness that made everything seem possible again. Clara stood outside the cabin, looking out at the barn, which now appeared even more forlorn in the light of day. The roof sagged, the doors hung loosely from their hinges, and the fence, though sturdy enough in parts, was more an illusion of strength than a true safeguard. Samuel came up behind her, the sound of his boots crunching against the gravel. He hadn't said much since they'd spoken last night, but there was something different in his step this morning, something more resolute, like a man who had decided to move forward instead of staying in the shadows of his past. Clara turned to face him, noticing how the soft morning light highlighted the lines of his face. There was an air about him now, something unspoken that hung between them, a quiet understanding that the work ahead wouldn't just be about repairing wood and nails. It would be about repairing something deeper. "We'll start with the barn." Clara's voice was firm but not unkind. She didn't need to say more. Samuel nodded, his eyes scanning the barn as if assessing where to begin. They worked together in silence for hours, moving lumber and tools to the barn, clearing away the debris that had accumulated over the years. The task was grueling, but neither of them flinched. Every now and then, Clara would glance at Samuel, who moved with a quiet precision, his hands sure as they handled the tools. Despite his rough exterior, there was a gentleness in the way he worked, the ease with which he set a beam in place, the careful attention he paid to every detail. It was the first time she had seen him focus on something with such dedication. It was in the midst of this task, as they both paused to take a much-needed break, that Samuel finally spoke. What happens if it's not enough? His voice was low, almost a whisper, as though he was afraid to voice the doubt that had been gnawing at him for the past few hours. Clara wiped the sweat from her brow, her gaze fixed on the barn as she thought about his question. It wasn't just about the barn, she realized. It was about everything. About whether she had the strength to continue, or if the weight of the past would swallow her whole. I don't know, Clara said honestly, her voice carrying a mix of vulnerability and resolve. But I have to try. Samuel nodded, but didn't say anything more. He took a swig of water from the flask they'd brought, and then set it down with a gentle thud. There was a quiet understanding between them, a sense that words were unnecessary at this moment. Both of them had their doubts, but neither would let the other see them break. As the day wore on, the tension that had existed between them began to dissolve. With every nail driven into the barn's frame, with every beam lifted and placed into position, the air around them seemed to shift. There was no more space for fear or hesitation, only the task at hand. By midday, they had completed the roof frame. It wasn't perfect, but it was sturdy, and that was enough for now. Clara felt a sense of satisfaction she hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't just about the barn. It was about the quiet trust that had begun to form between them. In that moment, she knew that Samuel wasn't just a man she had bought to help fix her ranch. He was something more. He was a part of this place now, a part of her. They sat together on the ground in the shade of the half-finished barn, the weight of the day's work settling over them like a heavy blanket. The air was thick with the promise of more to come, but there was a peace in knowing they had made progress. "Thank you," Clara said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a thank you for the work alone. It was a thank you for the understanding that had passed between them, for the quiet moments where words weren't necessary. Samuel met her gaze, his eyes steady and calm. "You're welcome." His voice was different now, less guarded, more open. It was as though he had allowed a piece of himself to show, just a crack, and Clara could see it. "I didn't expect this," he continued, his voice softer now. "I didn't expect someone to just offer me help, not after everything." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of his past. Clara turned her gaze to the barn, watching as the light began to shift, casting long shadows across the structure they had started to build together. "I don't know what you've been through, Samuel, but I can't change that. All I can do is offer you the chance to help me rebuild this place." She paused, looking at him, her eyes softening. "And maybe I'll let you help me rebuild something else too." For the first time since Clara had met him, Samuel smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It wasn't a smile born of joy, but of something deeper, something more meaningful, gratitude perhaps, or the smallest spark of hope. "I'll help you," he said, his voice steady, "and I'll stay." Clara's heart skipped a beat, and she looked at him again, her gaze steady. She wasn't sure what this meant, but she didn't need to know just yet. For now, this was enough. She had made the choice to trust him, and in return, he had trusted her. That was a beginning. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Each morning, they would rise early, the sun barely cresting over the horizon, and get to work. Together, they moved mountains. Well, not literal mountains, but the piles of timber and debris that had once been a farm. They cleared land, fixed fences, mended tools, and rebuilt the barn. With every passing day, the ranch began to look more like the place Clara had inherited, more like a home, even though it had never felt like one before. The work was grueling, but there was a strange satisfaction in it. As if with each nail they hammered, they were hammering away at the walls they had built around themselves. Trust, Clara realized, was not something that could be demanded or expected. It was something that grew slowly, like the first sprouts of a new season. As they worked, Samuel began to speak more. He didn't share much about his past, but the quiet moments they spent together, walking through the fields, fixing the barn, eating their meals by the fire, became their own unspoken language. There was something healing about the silence they shared, as if they both understood what the other had gone through, even without saying it. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Samuel spoke of his family, his mother, his father, and the land they had once lived on. He told Clara of the soldiers who had come, how they had taken everything from him and left him with nothing. But it wasn't the soldiers that haunted him. It was the memory of the land, the memory of his mother's voice, calling him back to the safety of home. Clara listened, not interrupting, just allowing him to speak. It was the first time he had ever shared anything with her, and she felt a deep ache for him. He had lived a life that no one should have to live. And yet, here he was, sitting by the fire with her, helping her rebuild a place that seemed as broken as he was. "It's not much," Samuel said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the past. "But I think it could be enough, for both of us." Clara didn't know what to say. She didn't have the words for it. But as she looked at him, at the man who had once been seen as nothing more than a savage, she realized that perhaps he was right. Perhaps this place could be enough for both of them. "We'll make it enough," she said, her voice steady. And in that moment, Clara knew this was just the beginning. There was still so much to be done, so many obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, she believed that together they could face whatever came next. The days began to stretch longer, the air growing warmer as spring slowly began to breathe life back into the land. The once barren fields started showing small signs of growth, green shoots that pushed through the cracked earth, reluctant but determined. Clara and Samuel had worked tirelessly, the rhythm of their labor becoming a language all its own. They repaired the barn, built new fences, and even managed to salvage a few of the cattle from the outskirts of a town, though not without difficulty. Every day felt like a small victory, a sign that, despite the odds, they were on the brink of something better. Yet, no matter how much progress they made, no matter how many nails were hammered into wood or boards straightened and fixed, the shadows of the past still loomed large. The town of Redstone Ridge hadn't forgotten Samuel's so-called crimes, nor had they forgotten Clara's audacity in buying him. It was on the 5th week of their labor that Clara first sensed a change in the air. It was subtle at first, a shift in the way the wind blew, the way people avoided eye contact when they passed by. The other ranchers in town, once her closest neighbors, began to keep their distance. At first, Clara chalked it up to their busy schedules, but she couldn't ignore the underlying tension. Whispers followed her wherever she went. The name Savage would occasionally float in the background of conversations, muttered just loud enough for her to hear. It was as if the town couldn't let go of the image they had constructed for Samuel, an image that Clara knew wasn't true but couldn't shake. One day, as she walked into town to gather supplies, she noticed the change more acutely. People who had once greeted her with a warm nod or a quick wave, now looked the other way. A group of women who had been friendly with her since Jacob's death huddled together on the steps of the general store, their eyes flicking nervously to Clara before returning to their quiet conversation. She could feel their gaze on her back as she passed, and though no one said a word, Clara knew the truth. They were talking about her, about Samuel, about what she had done. Clara stopped at the post office, her hands shaking as she reached for the door. Inside, the usual bustle of activity was quieted by the presence of several townspeople. It was as if they were all waiting for something to happen, waiting for someone to say something that would shatter the fragile peace they had been pretending to keep. "Clara," a voice called out. It was Mrs. Garrett, one of the older women in town, whose daughter Emma had recently been taken ill. Clara had helped her several times with the healing herbs from the little garden she kept by the cabin. Mrs. Garrett had always been polite, if not a little distant, but today her tone was different. Clara turned, forcing a smile. "Good morning, Miss Garrett. How is Emma?" The woman gave a tight-lipped smile, her eyes flicking nervously toward the others in the room. "She's doing better, thank you." She cleared her throat and took a hesitant step forward. "I've been meaning to talk to you." Clara's stomach twisted. "About what?" Mrs. Garrett glanced over her shoulder, her expression wary. The others in the room had stopped talking and were now watching the two women. It was as if the air itself had thickened with an unspoken tension. "Clara, I've heard things. People are talking, you know," Mrs. Garrett said, her voice low. "About Samuel, about what you've done buying him, and some of the other ranchers, they—" Clara's chest tightened. She had been expecting this, but hearing it out loud still hit like a blow. "What are they saying?" Clara's voice was steady, though her heart pounded. Mrs. Garrett hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. "They say he's dangerous, that he's a threat to our children, to our town. And some of the men, they say you're just as bad as he is." She paused, her face softening with some hidden regret. "I'm just telling you what's been said. You should be careful." Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had known this was coming, but the weight of it hit her all at once. She had chosen this path, but she hadn't expected it to turn on her so quickly. Her mind raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Garrett," Clara said, her voice tight but controlled. "I'll take care of it." As Clara left the post office, the full weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. The town wasn't just disapproving, they were beginning to turn against her. The whispers had grown louder, and now they were beginning to form a more dangerous shape. That afternoon, she decided to visit the sheriff's office. She had hoped that if anyone could help quell the growing unease, it would be Sheriff McKenna. But when she arrived, she found the sheriff in the company of two other ranchers, both of whom looked at her with cold eyes. "Clara," McKenna greeted her, his voice as impassive as ever. "What brings you by today?" Clara swallowed, trying to steady her voice. "I need to speak to you about the town, the people." She looked at the two ranchers who stood silently in the corner, watching her like hawks. "There are rumors, and they're starting to affect the work I'm doing on the ranch." McKenna's eyes narrowed, and the two ranchers exchanged a glance. "You've been talking to people, Clara. We're all aware of the situation with Samuel." Clara's pulse quickened. "You're aware? What do you mean by that?" One of the ranchers stepped forward, a burly man with a beard, his arms crossed over his chest. "We mean that folks around here don't trust him, and they don't trust you for keeping him under your roof. It's not safe. It's not right." Clara's heart clenched at his words, but she stood firm. "Samuel is just a man. He's not a threat to anyone. And as for me, I don't need your permission to do what I think is right." The sheriff's gaze softened, but the men behind him did not. "It's not about permission, Clara. It's about keeping the peace." McKenna's tone had lost its edge, but the message was clear. The town had decided. "I'm doing what I can to rebuild the ranch, and if that means working with Samuel, then I'll do it." Clara took a step forward, her voice unwavering. "But I'm asking you, Sheriff. No, I'm telling you, not to let your silence allow this kind of thinking to spread. If you don't stop the rumors, you're going to lose more than just a few neighbors." There was a long, tense pause as the sheriff regarded her, his eyes unreadable. The two ranchers stood to the side, their expressions guarded. Finally, McKenna sighed. "I'll see what I can do, but I can't control what people think, Clara. You'll need to handle your side of things." Clara nodded, her chest tight. She had expected more from the sheriff, but in the end, he was just a man trying to keep the peace. Whether that peace was just or not. Leaving the office, Clara knew this was just the beginning. She had no illusions about the road ahead. The town wasn't going to change overnight, and neither would the attitudes that had been ingrained in them for so long. But as she walked back toward the ranch, she felt something stir within her. A quiet fire, one that had always been there, but was now beginning to blaze a little brighter. The town could judge her. They could whisper and talk and try to tear her down. But she had something they didn't, something that couldn't be taken away. She had Samuel, and together they would fight for the future they were building, one nail at a time. The days grew longer, and with each passing one, Clara felt the weight of the town's judgment press harder against her shoulders. The once familiar faces she had known for years now avoided her gaze. Their whispers barely hushed as she walked by. It wasn't just a silent treatment. It was a subtle, ever-present coldness, like the chill that clung to the air before a storm. Even the animals on the ranch seemed to sense it, skittish and uneasy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. But Clara refused to falter. She couldn't afford to. Not when so much was at stake. Samuel, too, had felt the shift. He had always been a man of few words, but the quiet between them had grown heavier, laced with a tension neither of them could ignore. In the past few weeks, Clara had noticed that his eyes, once full of resolve and quiet strength, now often seemed distant, like he was carrying a weight she couldn't see, a burden from his past that still lingered in his every movement. Clara had tried to bridge the silence, offering him small gestures of kindness, cups of coffee, small conversations about the ranch, the weather, but there was a barrier between them that neither of them had yet learned how to cross. It was on a quiet afternoon, as Clara was walking along the newly repaired fence line, that she saw something that would change everything. At first, it was just a flicker of movement in the distance, but as she got closer, her heart sank. A group of men, ranchers from town, were gathered by the edge of her property. They weren't just passing through. This was no casual visit. Clara could see them standing in a loose but purposeful circle, and in the center stood Samuel. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she approached, her boots crunching loudly against the gravel. She tried to keep her steps quiet, but the men had already seen her. One of them, A burly man named Carl Jensen looked at her with an expression that sent a cold shiver down her spine. "Clara," Carl said, his voice gruff, "we need to talk." The other men shifted, their eyes fixed on her, their expressions a mixture of disdain and something else, something darker. Clara's heart raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. About what? Clara's voice was steady, but she felt the blood drain from her face. She had learned over the past few weeks that a confrontation like this could only mean trouble. Samuel stood silently in the center, his hands resting by his sides. There was no defiance in his posture, no anger, just silence. "We've had enough of this, Clara." It was Dale Morrison, one of the oldest ranchers in town, who spoke next. His voice was thick with contempt, but there was a tinge of something more, something dangerous. Clara clenched her fists at her sides, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Had enough of what?" she asked, her voice low. "You and him." Dale gestured towards Samuel, his tone venomous. "We've all heard the stories. We know what kind of man he is, what kind of woman you are for keeping him around. You think you're above all this?" Clara's pulse quickened, but she didn't back down. "Samuel is just a man. He's done nothing wrong here." "Nothing wrong?" Carl spat on the ground, his gaze sharp. "He's a thief, a savage, and you're protecting him like he's some kind of hero. You've brought shame to this place, Clara." Samuel stirred slightly, but said nothing. Clara could see the weight of their words settling on him, each accusation sinking deeper into his skin. "I don't need you to protect me," Samuel said finally, his voice soft but clear. He turned to Clara, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or something deeper that Clara couldn't quite read. But it was enough for her to see that this wasn't just about the ranch or the town anymore. It was about something personal, something that had nothing to do with the past he had been running from, but everything to do with what he was becoming. "We've had enough of this nonsense, Clara." Dale's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You're not welcome in this town anymore, not with him." Clara's heart thudded in her chest as she took a step forward, standing her ground. "I don't need your approval. I've made my choice." "Your choice is going to cost you," Carl said, stepping closer, his face twisted in anger. "This is a warning. Stay away from our land. Stay away from our people, or things will get worse for you." Clara's mind raced, but her body was steady. She had known this moment was coming. She had expected it, but the reality of it still felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about the ranch. This was about her life, about her right to live it on her own terms. She turned to Samuel, her heart aching as she saw the resignation in his eyes. But there was something else there too, something that felt like defeat. It was the same look he had worn the night they had first met, when he had stood chained and broken before the townspeople. But Clara wouldn't let that happen again. She refused to let him carry the weight of their judgment, of their hate. "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said firmly, her voice ringing with a determination that surprised even her. She looked back at the men, each of them standing taller, their collective presence trying to intimidate her. "You can't force me to leave. You can't scare me into silence." There was a moment of heavy silence before Dale spoke again, his words low but sharp. "We'll see about that." Without another word, the men turned and walked off, leaving Clara and Samuel standing alone by the eye fence. The air felt thick, as if the very earth had held its breath, waiting for a storm that had yet to arrive. Clara stood there, her fists still clenched, her body tense with the weight of the confrontation. She didn't look at Samuel at first. She couldn't. But she could feel him there beside her, the weight of his presence, both a comfort and a reminder of the path they had chosen. "They won't stop," Clara said finally, her voice hoarse. "They'll never accept you. Not here." Samuel didn't answer at first. He didn't need to. She could see it in the way he stood, the way he held himself. He was used to being rejected, used to being seen as less than human, as a savage. But there was something about Clara's defiance, something about her unrelenting resolve that sparked something in him. "They will have to," he said, his voice steady. "We'll make them." Clara turned to him, her heart beating faster as she saw the flicker of hope in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time since this journey began, she felt a surge of something that had been missing. The belief that maybe, just maybe, they could change things. But the truth was, the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. They had only just begun to scratch the surface of what lay ahead. The town would continue to push back, and the stakes would continue to rise. But Clara and Samuel were no longer alone in this fight. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the ranch, Clara made a silent vow to herself and to Samuel. No matter what came next, she would not let this fight break her, and together they would stand against the storm. The days following the confrontation at the ranch were a mix of tension and quiet determination. Clara felt it everywhere she went. Her every move scrutinized, the air thick with the weight of judgment from the town. But she refused to let the growing pressure break her. Every morning, she woke up with the same purpose: to rebuild the ranch and to give Samuel a chance at the life he deserved. The work continued, but it had taken on a different tone. It was no longer just about fixing the barn or mending fences. It was about proving something, both to the town and to themselves. Every board they nailed into place, every beam they lifted, felt like a defiance against a world that wanted to see them fail. Samuel had become more than just a laborer. He was her partner in this struggle, and the two of them had started to form something stronger than just a working relationship. It was a bond forged in the heat of adversity. But even as they made progress, Clara knew it wasn't enough. The town wasn't going to back down. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they had only grown louder. More than once, Clara had overheard the men at the saloon talking about her, about Samuel, about the damage they were doing to the community's reputation. It wasn't just their pride they were protecting anymore. It was something deeper, an entrenched belief that people like Samuel had no place in their world. Then, one morning, Clara received a letter. It was sealed with the official insignia of the town council, and as she broke the seal and unfolded the paper, she felt a sense of dread settle over her chest. The letter was formal, its tone cold and legal. "Clara Whitford, it has come to our attention that your actions have disrupted the peace and harmony of Redstone Ridge. Specifically, your continued association with Samuel Tallbear, a known criminal, has caused undue stress to the town and its citizens. We regret to inform you that unless Samuel is removed from your property and the situation is rectified, you will be forced to vacate the premises and will be prohibited from any further involvement in the town's affairs. We urge you to make the right decision for the good of all involved." Clara's hand shook as she read the words again. They were clear. They weren't just asking her to stop. They were forcing her to choose between the ranch and the town, between Samuel and everything she had known. The silence in the cabin that morning felt heavier than ever before. Samuel was outside, working on the fence that stretched along the north edge of the property. Clara stared at the letter, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She didn't need to think about it long. She knew what had to be done. It wasn't the first time she had been faced with a decision like this. After Jacob's death, she had been forced to choose whether to let the ranch go, to sell it off and move on, or to fight for it. She had fought then, and now she would fight again. But this time the stakes were higher. This time the fight wasn't just for her, it was for Samuel too. Clara folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, walking outside to find Samuel. As she approached him, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weariness that had taken hold of him after weeks of work. But there was something else there too, a quiet determination, the same determination she had seen in him from the beginning. "You got a letter from the town, didn't you?" Samuel's voice was calm, but Clara could see the way his jaw tightened. Clara nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, they want me to send you away." Samuel didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The words were enough. Clara could see the internal struggle playing out in his eyes. He wasn't surprised. He had known deep down that this moment would come. "What do you want to do?" Samuel finally asked, his voice barely a whisper, but full of weight. Clara looked at the work they had done, the progress they had made, the life they had started to build together. Then she looked at Samuel, this man who had been written off by the world, who had faced the darkest corners of life, and yet stood beside her, ready to fight. He wasn't a threat. He was a person, a man, her partner. "I'm not leaving." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "And neither are you." Samuel's lips twitched into a small, approving smile, though his eyes remained serious. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and placed a hand on her shoulder. The weight of his touch was grounding, like a promise. "Then we fight." His words were simple, but they carried more weight than any declaration could. They weren't just words. They were a commitment to something bigger than themselves. For a brief moment, Clara allowed herself to feel the warmth of that promise. She had never expected to be here, in this place, fighting not just for the ranch, but for something more, something intangible, yet real. She had never imagined that she would be standing side by side with someone like Samuel. But here they were, and this was the life they were going to build, no matter what anyone else said. But their decision wasn't without consequence. That afternoon, Clara went into town, determined to face the council head on. The town hall was located at the edge of Redstone Ridge, a weathered building that had seen decades of history unfold within its walls. As Clara approached, she could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on her, could almost hear the murmurs behind the closed doors. Inside, the council was waiting. Sheriff McKenna sat at the head of the table, flanked by several of the town's wealthier ranchers, including Dale Morrison, who had made no secret of his disdain for Clara's choices. The room grew quiet as she entered, every eye turning toward her, with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. "Clara Whitford," Sheriff McKenna said, his voice as flat and professional as ever. "We've received your response to our letter, but you must understand, this isn't just about you and Samuel. This is about the safety and reputation of the entire town." Clara stood firm, meeting the sheriff's gaze without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither is Samuel." There was a murmur around the room, a ripple of surprise, and even a few smirks. But Clara didn't falter. She had known this wouldn't be easy. She had known the town wasn't just going to accept her, but she was willing to fight. "You're making a mistake, Clara," Dale Morrison said, his voice thick with anger. "This town can't live with this kind of shame. You're forcing us to choose between you and the community." "Then choose," Clara said, her voice unwavering, "because I'm choosing Samuel. I'm choosing what's right. And if you want to run me off, you'll have to do it yourselves. But I won't back down. Not now. Not ever." The room fell silent. The weight of Clara's words hung in the air, and for the first time, the townspeople weren't sure what to say. Clara's defiance had caught them off guard. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for Samuel, for something bigger than any of them had anticipated. Sheriff McKenna leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You realize the consequences of your decision, Clara. This town isn't going to forget." Clara nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "I know, but I've made my choice, and nothing you say is going to change it." The council remained silent for a long moment. Finally, McKenna spoke, his voice quieter now. "Then you've made your stand, and we've made ours." Clara didn't say anything more. She turned and walked out of the room, her steps firm and sure. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the ranch. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the promise of change. Clara and Samuel stood together, looking out over the land they had fought for. They had made their choice, and together they would face whatever came next.